In the early 2050s, the new plague ravaged America. With its origins unknown, America responded by quarantining entire communities, upending the country's social structure. But it wasn't going away on its own, and so in 2055, the US government tasked a company called Westech to come up with a cure. But this plague could not have come at a worse time for the world. The entire globe was suffering from a fossil fuel shortage, and nations were starting to take desperate measures to make sure that their people had access to the world's fossil fuels. By this time, America had already invaded Mexico to seize Mexico's oil fields. This began the resource wars, and every major power on the planet began to scramble to gobble up the world's remaining pockets of fossil fuels. The European Commonwealth invaded the Middle East to seize their fossil fuels, but that just led to a prolonged war where Europe and the Middle East both disintegrated into a bunch of warring nation-states. In 2053, Tel Aviv was leveled by a nuclear detonation, and America saw the writing on the wall. Global conflict was not only coming, but it was already here. And so Westech, while simultaneously working on a cure for the new plague, began to think of ways of using their technology offensively as well. And so another division within Westech began to develop a mechanized infantry, something that no other nation had, something that would give America the upper hand on the battlefield for when boots on the ground became inevitable. By 2065, research into mechanized powered armor was fully underway. By now, the oil fields in Europe had all dried up. Alaska's oil fields were some of the last left in the world, and the United States realized that they needed to defend them. And so America began to build up a military presence in Alaska. Westech's technology developed quickly, so that by 2066, they had developed the world's first fusion cell, a technology specifically created to power armor. With the fusion cell, America had unlocked a horde of fusion technology, including powerful nuclear weapons and nuclear fuel. In this year, America unveiled its power armor publicly. The first suit of its kind ever created, the T-45. The heart and soul of power armor was the power armor frame. Now, the power armor frame itself is a bit of a retcon, introduced to the Fallout universe only in Fallout 4. Before then, power armor was depicted as individual suit pieces that were put on, pieces that required power armor training in order to fully utilize. However, even in the older games, power armor was described less as a suit that you put on and more like a vehicle you stepped into and controlled.
Think of power armor as a machine to be operated, rather than clothing you'd wear. With a little instruction, using it becomes as natural as simple movement. But to the ignorant, it's just so much heavy junk.
Even the original description of power armor from Fallout 1 describes it as having a frame that the suit's hydraulic system was built into. However, the way the suit is powered has been retconned a bit over the years. Originally, the suit's power was described as a microfusion pack attached to the back of the suit that generated 60,000 watts of power. In Fallout 4, this was changed from a pack to a large but portable and ejectable fusion cell called a fusion core. And so while previous games did depict power armor as a suit, the retcon of the power armor frame realizes power armor the way the original developers intended it. The power armor frame gives power armor many of its unique battlefield-changing attributes. It's the power armor frame that has built-in shock absorbers that makes anyone wearing a suit of power armor impervious to fall damage. It's the power armor frame that has gyros and servos that increase run speed, improving a suit's kinetic impact force. And it's the power armor frame that increases the soldier's carrying capacity, for the first time allowing infantry soldiers to turn heavy weapons that otherwise could only be carried by vehicles into back and shoulder-mounted weapons. Weapons that a single soldier could carry into combat. The great achievement of Westtech was the invention of the power armor frame. The first suit to be attached to a power armor frame was the T-45, and the T-45 had its problems. It was a rushed job, barely beyond prototype stage.
Westtech.
It's a defense contractor.
Oh, I'm very familiar with you guys. You designed the T-45 power armor.
Your first of its kind. The design flaws were ridiculous, but they sure looked great.
But with the whole world a powder keg about to blow up, Westtech went into mass production, and just in time. In the winter of 2066, due to the fossil fuel shortage, America enacted an indefinite embargo on the export of U.S. petroleum worldwide. Communist China, on the brink of internal collapse due to their own fossil fuel shortage, responded by invading Alaska, a desperate attempt to get their hands on Alaska's oil fields. America responded in January of 2067 by issuing the entrenched Alaskan defenders with suits of T-45. And power armor became the pivotal technology that America used to defend Alaska.
I wore the T-45 when we almost lost the great state of Alaska to the Reds. Those design flaws here has cost a lot of good men and women their lives.
Even though it was imperfect, even though it was rushed into production, soldiers in T-45 were still able to carry heavy ordnance into battle. Ordnance that their Chinese enemies could only bring into battle using tanks and mechanized transport. But it wasn't an instant victory. Power armor allowed America to stabilize the front in Alaska, but it didn't give them an instant win. China had managed to entrench themselves in Alaska and had secured access to some of Alaska's oil deposits. This drained America's fuel reserves. America worked with Canada to create an Alaskan pipeline to deliver oil from Alaska to America through Canada, but after some Canadian saboteurs tried to sabotage the pipeline, America responded by annexing Canada, which they started in 2072. But for many years, they struggled against Canadian freedom fighters, and though officially annexed in 2072, it wasn't completely pacified until 2077. By 2073, China had failed to end the stalemate in Alaska, and so in a desperate attempt to find any sort of battlefield advantage, the Chinese government authorized the use of biological weapons against America. Now, Westtech had been working on a cure for the new plague for many years now, and with the threat of biological weapons from China, they began to broaden their research to create something that would cure everything, the new plague and any contagion from China. This project became known as the Pan-Immunity Virion Project. But while working on this project, Westtech scientists created their own viral agent that had potentially impressive offensive capabilities. And so Westtech, though they never found a cure for the new plague, or a cure for any of China's biological weapons, spun off a section of their research team to nurse this new virus into something that they could use to create super soldiers. This new virus was called the Forced Evolutionary Virus. FEV. Though it did have potential, they were never successful. And with an extended stalemate in Alaska, America needed to do something now to turn the tide of the war. And so America decided to invade mainland China to relieve pressure on their troops in Alaska. U.S. soldiers wearing T-45 arrived in Shantou, Nanjing, and the Gobi Desert, trying to divert China's attention away from Alaska. But America discovered that the T-45 suits of power armor weren't working quite as well in China. They were getting bogged down in the desert. And newer Chinese technologies like the Gauss rifle were proving surprisingly effective against the T-45. The strain of combat in both Alaska and mainland China was causing the T-45 to burn through fusion cells at an unsustainable rate. And so in 2074, the US military, in conjunction with Westtech, began production on a new suit of power armor, the T-51. The T-51 spent years in production. Suits were being tested at Fort Strong in Massachusetts, and they just weren't providing the desired mobility and protection needed for battle. Additionally, the units had a hard time remaining stable after soldiers took hard landings, which required investment into gyroscopic stabilizers and shock absorbers. Despite all of these delays, eventually, Westech was able to put the T-51 into production in June of 2076, and these new suits of power armor were sent to American troops on all fronts. The T-51 outperformed the T-45 in every way. It not only helped them make progress in mainland China, but it gave them the edge they needed to break the stalemate in Alaska. And in January of 2077, America won the Battle of Anchorage, definitively defeating the Chinese on American soil and forcing them back. The retreating Chinese troops from Alaska were redeployed across the Chinese front. And while America and their T-51 had been cutting their way through the Chinese like butter, with the Chinese reinforcements from the failed Anchorage offensive, America once again found themselves in a stalemate. They may have liberated Anchorage, Alaska, but they had yet to win the war.
Chinese forces may have finally been driven from Anchorage, but the conflict has transitioned into a frighteningly tense stalemate. With diplomacy all but suspended and conventional warfare taking a historic toll on both sides, many have wondered if the good old US of A hasn't finally entered into a fight it just can't win.
That said, the T-51 had been a game changer, and America dove feet first into developing new power armor models. While the T-51 was being deployed to troops, Westech had been working on an upgrade to the T-45. But this new suit of power armor ended up being so distinct that America decided to release it as its own series. This T-60 power armor was primarily issued to troops who came back from the Alaska front to engage in domestic peacekeeping. The T-60 was an impressive suit of power armor. It surpassed even the T-51 in some areas, providing environmental protection so good that it could withstand the blast from rocket engines designed to take satellites into orbit without even causing its occupant to sweat.
Oh my God, are you all right? Got cooked by those flames. But thanks to my power armor, I'm still in one piece.
However, it still had some of the fatal design flaws of the T-45.
There was a flaw in the welding just below the chest plate. I wonder if they fix that in this new model. I guess not.
Some parts of the US government used Westech's technology to create their own suits of power armor. The United States Secret Service, for example, built upon what Westech had done with the T-60 to create a covert style of power armor dubbed the T-65. It was supposed to be used only by Secret Service agents, and so the limited suits that were made and plans for these suits were sent to Vault 79, where the Secret Service was guarding America's gold from Fort Knox. And there were parts of America's government who were convinced that a nuclear apocalypse was imminent. And so some shadowy parts of America's government began to develop some experimental suits of power armor for use only after a nuclear catastrophe. This experimental suit, dubbed the XO-1, was never issued to troops. It never got out of the experimental phase, but a few prototypes of the suit were manufactured. Some were kept safe in the Congressional Bunker in Appalachia. Many others were scattered amongst a variety of military installations across America. One was even used in advertising, with John Caleb Bradburton using his military contacts due to his cooperation with Project Cobalt to get his hands on a suit of this experimental armor and emblazon it with Nuka-Cola Quantum marketing. Indeed, with power armor being seen as the embodiment of the might of America and the right of capitalism, power armor was used to hawk a variety of goods, from Vim to sugar bombs. Power armor would market them all. Every brand wanted to have their logo on a suit of power armor. The private sector saw the potential value of power armor outside of combat. The mining companies of Appalachia were in thick competition with each other. The The Hornwrights were investing in robots, machines, auto miners, removing the human element from the mining industries of Appalachia. But other companies like the Garahans thought that power armor might be a way to keep themselves competitive while also preserving their human workforce. And so, building upon the power armor frame that Westtech had developed, the Garahan Mining Company created its own suit of power armor designed specifically for excavation. It ended up losing when placed in contest with the Hornwrights auto miners, and so sadly the Garahan Company failed. Another company, Grafton Steel, was inspired by power armor as well. They tried to create a heat-resistant version of power armor based on the T-51 that would make it safer for their steel mill workers and also make them more efficient. However, Grafton Steel was never able to create more than a prototype for their helmet because on October 23, 2077, the bombs dropped. The nuclear apocalypse ended the United States of America, and in so doing, ended America's development of power armor. But the ingenuity of the power armor frame made it so that survivors of the Great War built upon America's technology to create their own post-war versions of power armor. The most bare-bones example of this is Raider power armor. When society collapsed, survivors who took to pillaging from other people instead of producing their own food and goods became raiders, and raiders were found across the continental United States. Some of these raiders managed to get their hands on America's power armor frames. Most of these frames likely came from destroyed or decommissioned suits of T-45 that were brought back from Alaska after the successful defense of Anchorage. Cunning raiders welded pieces of scrap metal and rebar to power armor frames to produce a rough and hacked-together version of power armor that provided some but little further protection than the power armor frame by itself. Other survivors, however, proved to be much more industrious. Even before the bombs dropped in 2077, China had been working to reverse engineer America's power armor. They never succeeded, instead putting most of their efforts into Chinese stealth technology. But after the Great War, there were some Chinese survivors who refused to realize that the rivalry between the United States and China had ended. Some of these survivors had infiltrated America before the bombs dropped, establishing bunkers and labs on American soil, and after the apocalypse, continued to work on reverse engineering power armor. Some of these Chinese infiltrators were successful. Taking particular inspiration from the T-45, they managed to produce a suit of power armor that was pretty simple and bare bones, but while inferior to American models, still offering substantial protection compared to the hacked-together suits produced by raiders. That said, the communist power armor suits are rare. In fact, some communist schools still alive prefer to use pre-war American power armor. It's doubtful that the communist power armor ever went into mass production due to the isolated nature of communist Chinese infiltrator compounds on American soil. In fact, the units appear to be so few that only high-ranking Chinese survivors, Chinese commissars, wield them in combat. In the ruins of Pittsburgh, survivors and former members of Pittsburgh's pre-war steelworkers union found themselves under assault from a tribe of raiders called the Fanatics. But these union survivors had experience in metalworking, and after finding some power armor frames, used their expertise to craft their own version of power armor, the Union power armor. This Union power armor was made from scraps of leftover steel scattered around Pittsburgh, but due to the high levels of craftsmanship that the Union members had compared to that of raiders, the power armor they ultimately produced was much more impressive. It offered substantial protection. But the Union workers weren't the only ones who had access to power armor frames. bands of mercenaries began to emerge in the wasteland, selling their combat experience to the highest bidder. Some of these mercenaries, like the Gunners in Boston, were able to use salvaged pre-war suits of power armor. But others, like the Hellcats in Appalachia, somehow managed to craft their own unique suits of power armor. The Hellcat Company mercenaries were hired by the fanatic raiders in Pittsburgh to fight the Union. And with the Union arming themselves with their own power armor, the Hellcats needed to do the same. Due to their strict militarized structure, there are some who think that the Hellcat Company were remnants of pre-war America's military. Wherever they originated, and however they achieved this, they managed to produce a suit of power armor unlike anything else seen in the wasteland. It doesn't resemble anything made by America. It doesn't look hacked together with pieces of scrapped metal. It looks impressive and professional. And honestly, I struggle to understand how a post-war mercenary faction hired by raiders could have possibly achieved this. But the evidence is irrefutable. Their armor exists in the universe, and so achieve it, they did. There are a variety of other power armor suits found in Fallout 76 that can only be purchased from the Atomic Shop and are never actually found in the world by themselves or ever used in any canonical story set in Appalachia. And so for the purposes of this video, I'll consider them to be cosmetic, non-canonical suits of power armor that don't need a lore explanation. This includes any suit of power armor that appears as a result of the Creation Club, such as the Captain Cosmos power armor that hasn't been later canonized by Bethesda. However, most post-war factions in the Wasteland that used power armor simply used the abundance of pre-war America's suits of power armor that littered the Wasteland. The most prominent example of this, of course, is the Brotherhood of Steel. The Brotherhood of Steel was comprised of the remnants of pre-war America's military, and so from the very foundation of their order, their knights wore America's power armor, in particular, the T-51. Different chapters of the Brotherhood had different power armor preferences. Lion's Brotherhood of Steel in the Capital Wasteland preferred the T-45, while Maxon's Brotherhood that succeeded Lion's and moved to Boston preferred the T-60. While they rarely innovated on the design of power armor, they were able to repair it. But they did attempt to create new suits of power armor. After the Brotherhood's satellite chapter in Appalachia came under attack from the Scorched Plague, the scribes on the West Coast designed a suit of power armor that they hoped would better protect their soldiers in Appalachia. This suit was called the Ultracite power armor, and it never went into production. In fact, a prototype was never even made. However, the West Coast scribes were able to send the blueprints for this suit of power armor to the Brotherhood in Appalachia. And from these blueprints, survivors of Vault 76 could have created their own suits. Many years later, after a great schism within the Brotherhood that sent a bunch of their order on Zeppelins across the continental United States, Brotherhood survivors of the resulting Zeppelin crash managed to create their own unique and distinct suit of power armor, which is called Advanced Power Armor in the game, but since there are many other suits in the canon called Advanced, it's been dubbed the Midwestern Brotherhood Power Armor. It even comes with a cape. This suit of power armor appears in Fallout Tactics, and since Fallout Tactics has only been confirmed to be partially canonical, we don't know for sure if this suit of power armor ever truly existed in the canon. However, since it plays such a widespread role in the events of Fallout Tactics, I have a hard time imagining how, if anything in Tactics is canonical, this suit of power armor could not be. And so I include it here. But of all the post-war factions in the Wasteland to build upon America's pre-war power armor technology, the most successful, inarguably, was the Enclave. The Enclave was the very same shadowy organization before the war who produced the X-01, the experimental suit that never left the prototype stage. After the bombs dropped, the Enclave made sure that blueprints for the X-01 was shared extensively among the Enclave's various labs and bunkers. including their primary shelter, where the President of the United States survived the apocalypse, Control Station Enclave, the remnants of a Poseidon Energy oil rig off the coast of San Francisco. Here, Enclave soldiers continued to use T-51 suits of power armor until Enclave scientists managed to put into production a suit of power armor they simply called Advanced Power Armor, which was essentially the XO-1, since it was based on the XO-1 schematics, and the Enclave had it in such great quantities that they were able to issue it to most of their troops. But they continued to improve even upon this, for at some point before the year 2241, the Enclave at the oil rig had managed to create the Advanced Power Armor Mark II, an upgrade to the Mark I, also known as the XO-2 suit of power armor, nicknamed the Black Devil Power Armor. The blueprints for these suits of power armor were shared with the Enclave base at Raven Rock, either over Poseidonet or were brought with them by Autumn Sr. during the Enclave's exodus to the East Coast after the destruction of the oil rig. Here, the new president of the Enclave, John Henry Eden, continued to manufacture Advanced and Advanced Mark II, XO-1 and XO-2 suits of power armor and distribute them to Enclave troopers. But there was another suit that they were working on, and possibly had been working on for quite some time. At some point, just after the bombs dropped, the Enclave, chapter unspecified, had already created a prototype for the Hellfire power armor. We know this because a supercomputer named Zax at Vault 51 managed to imitate the personality of Vault-Tech scientist Stanislaus Braun to request a suit of Hellfire power armor from the Enclave in the year 2080, less than a decade after the bombs dropped. And the Enclave, again chapter unspecified, fulfilled his request, sending Zax a prototype of Hellfire power armor to Vault 51. Aside from this one prototype suit found in Appalachia, the Enclave's Hellfire power armor didn't appear again until 200 years later. It was John Henry Eden's Enclave, after seizing Project Purity and expanding operations to the Adams Air Force Base, that was able to finally perfect the Hellfire power armor using assets from their canceled Duraframe project. With the design complete, they were able to issue the Hellfire power armor to troops during their war with Lion's Brotherhood of Steel. There is one final suit of power armor created by the Enclave, but which has very little explanation in the lore. Before the bombs dropped in 2077, the Enclave, under the direction of Secretary of Agriculture Thomas Eckhart, who later became the self-proclaimed president of the Enclave in Appalachia, took over an atomic mining services facility and turned it into a lab that was researching ultracite. They were stimulating ultracite crystals with sound waves, which transformed the crystal, turning it ultragenetic, and then exposing these ultragenetic ultracite crystals to fauna to see what the results would be. The research going on here was apparently so important that Secretary Eckhart dispatched a squad of Enclave soldiers, Enclave Squad Epsilon, to guard this facility. For some reason, Project Vulcan lost contact with the congressional bunker only a few months after the bombs dropped. It's never explained how, but it might have something to do with how the congressional bunker lost contact with Raven Rock and the oil rig, as we explored in my video on the Enclave's Civil War. It's likely Eckhart and his goon Mr. Gray severed the connection themselves. But this squad of soldiers was geared in a unique suit of power armor that we don't find anywhere else. Ultimately, however, Enclave Squad Epsilon fell victim to the Scorched Plague, and their unique suit of power armor, called Vulcan power armor, began to grow green ultracite crystals. This power armor is never really explained. It has a familial resemblance to the XO-1 and its successor, the XO-2, but we don't know where it was manufactured and why there were so few suits of it only given to Enclave Squad Epsilon. However, somehow, Eckhart's Enclave must have shared this design with the West Coast, because decades later, when the Chosen One confronts the mutant Frank Horrigan at the Enclave oil rig, Frank Horrigan is wearing a suit of power armor with a helmet that looks a heck of a lot like the Vulcan power armor from the gleaming depths in Appalachia. Before the war, America expended enormous resources and a great amount of time producing a powered infantry technology that revolutionized warfare across the globe. And after the apocalypse, the legacy of their technology spread to every corner of the wasteland, empowering factions to do great good in the wasteland and others to do great evil. Which of these canonical suits is your favorite? Are there any I excluded that you think should have been included in this list? Are there any I included that you don't think should be considered canonical? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As always, thanks for watching.